Welcome to issue 39 of Language Testing Bytes. It's been almost 10 months since our last issue, and I'm excited to welcome back our viewers. And in today's issue, we're going to talk about the special issue on accommodations in language testing and assessment that has recently been published in Language Testing Journal. The special issue was co-edited by two guest editors, Dr. Lynda Taylor and Dr. Jayanti Banerjee, who graciously agreed to talk to me today about this issue and the studies that are included in it. So we'll start with the first question, and this is about the topic of the special issue. Could you please tell us a little bit more about the topic of your special issue, which is accommodations in language testing and assessment? In particular, I'd like to know why you chose this topic and why you find this topic important.
Okay, well, let me start with a little bit of a response to that. First of all, it's lovely to be here. It's lovely to be sharing the platform with Jay, because actually Jay and I have had an interest in this area for quite a long time and have written elsewhere in different places about the issue of accommodations in language testing and assessment. So she was a natural partner when thinking about whether we could do something a bit bigger than individual chapters, which is what we've done in the past. And it occurred to me that language testing, as a premier journal in the field, if you like, had never had a special issue on this particular topic. It's not that there haven't been papers, although there haven't been that many papers published in language testing or in some other journals like Language Assessment Quarterly on aspects of this area, but there'd never been, in the 40 years of its history, a special issue. And it also seemed important and timely to give some focus to this area in our field in light of interest in and commitment to matters of equity, diversity, inclusion, and access in language teaching, learning, and especially in language assessment. So I suppose the motivation stems from what I've just described. And also, I think it's of its time in terms of where we find ourselves at the moment in the ethics and the policy, the research and the practice in our field of language testing and assessment, which has grown enormously in recent years, but hadn't really had a sustained focus on this particular dimension.
I think the one bit that I'd like to add, and we will probably come to this later on in this vlog as well, is that this is both a theoretically important area, but also an extremely practically important area. And one of the reasons why Lynda and I have so much enjoyed working together on this is because we have a background both in the practical application of these decisions for real candidates, as well as a theoretical interest in what this means with respect to the tests that we are administering, what the score means, what we're actually assessing with respect to the candidates. That's why the topic is so important. It has real life impact on the individuals who require an accommodation.
And I think following that point up, we have a much greater awareness today than we did perhaps 10 or 15 or 20 years ago of the number of individuals who in society, in education, in employment, are living with and navigating challenges to do with, it could be disability, it could be circumstances, it could be life conditions, and for whom it's important that there is an awareness of how their needs and their aspirations can be met in a theoretically sound and a practically accessible way.
Yeah, in your editorial, I saw that you mentioned that actually about 15% of the population, I think, have some sort of a disability potentially. And your special issue contains 6 studies. Could you tell us a little bit more about these studies? And in particular, I wonder if you could talk about what kind of problems or issues these studies explored, What were some main findings? What are some similarities and differences among the studies that you included? And what are the main implications of their findings?
One of the things we're most proud of with respect to the papers that are included in the special issue is the range of contexts that are captured, both geographically and educationally. So there are large-scale standardized language tests, there are K through 12 examples of K through 12 assessment, examples of assessments in very specific contexts where the assessment has been developed very specifically for learners with special needs. And there's also actually a theoretical reflection on the language we use to talk about learners with special needs so that our language is more inclusive.
Jay's absolutely right that, and perhaps taking a step back, one of the interesting things about this special issue is that we identified 6 studies to report, but in actual fact, we didn't have many more than 6 studies submitted. And now if you compare this with the previous special issue on local tests, local contexts, I think there were over 100 submissions for that, which is indicative of the fact that it's a relatively small number of people who are doing this sort of work to the degree to which it could achieve some sort of published status. And that's very interesting, I think, because this has been a somewhat marginalized dimension, perhaps, of our field. And what we wanted to do was to bring it firmly into focus. So the 6 studies that we have cover quite a range of different contexts, as Jay has said, ranging from, for example, the first study was looking at the development of a systematic accessibility review process for L2 English proficiency tests designed for young learners in the US. Another study also in the US sought to examine the extent to which school-age English language learners, both with and without disabilities, activated word processing tools, referred to as universal tools, in their online English language proficiency assessment. We had another study which looked at the development in a different part of the world of a special accommodations policy associated with a large-scale localized computer-based language test for the workplace, and how that was implemented. And there the focus was very much on perceptions and stakeholder responses to that approach. Another US-based study looked at designing and developing accessible tests for blind and visually impaired learners, and focused very much on the methodology here, the participatory co-design methodology, which is actually something that you find sometimes as a thread across multiple studies. Another test based in Austria was the site for an investigation into the provision of self-pacing for young English language learners who could pause and replay their listening input at will. And then the final paper is the more conceptual paper. So I think if we look across the range, we find different geographic contexts, we find different demographic age ranges, we find educational and workplace contexts for the assessments, we find different disability cohorts, as it were. And this gives it a real richness as a special issue. There are common threads running amongst the papers, of course, but they are all highly diverse as well, and each brings something unique, in my view.
There are a couple of things that perplexed Lynda and me all the way through the process, which were the relatively few formal pieces of work that were being done. And 2, the fact that it is actually quite hard to bring these papers into a published state because they tend to be very low end size and also tend to use methodologies that people might not approve of. We might need to develop a greater openness to non-standard methodologies in order to effectively work with these populations.
I think it must be over 10 years ago now when Jay and I both put some papers together independently in this area. And I think part of our conversation then was, why is there not more published in this area? Why is there so little? that can inform decision making or good practice. And we acknowledge then that research in this area is not easy because very often the cohorts are not large. They don't lend themselves to methodologies that we are very used to in our field, and that, in all fairness, language testing has tended to publish predominantly on quantitative methodologies. And when you start to try and break things down, you end up with, I think, what Jay referred to as sort of vanishingly small cohort or cell size that makes it very difficult to make any definitive judgments on findings. So in a sense, one of your questions is, what do you think the findings are out of a set of studies like this? And I think I would say partly that they're not going to generate the sorts of definitive knowledge and guidance that we might normally expect. But what they do is point to the highly diverse nature of the test-taking population and to the increasing need for very individualized, personalized responses to requests for accommodations, which sort of run a bit counter to what we do in language testing and assessment, which is all about standardization and fairness. The notion of doing something that is non-standard doesn't sit very comfortably with us. But I also think that possibly we need to move away from that sort of binary paradigm of it's standard for most people, but it's non-standard for others who need something a bit different. And that whole process of standard, non-standard actually means that we do other people. And I think we can do better, particularly in a digital and technological age.
And also the assumption that in order to be fair, it has to be the same for everyone, standardized. And that isn't, especially with the newer conceptualizations of equity, that actually is no longer the case. Equity isn't about giving everybody the same. It's about making sure everybody has the same opportunity.
I think that, the growth of our understanding in sort of beginning to discern the difference between equity and equality is a really important and timely one. And if the papers in all their diversity have anything in common, one dimension is that they all recognize the challenge, and they all recognize the importance of working collaboratively together with test takers, test organization providers, parents, and the other stakeholders in the testing and assessment endeavor. That is something that has grown substantially. Our understanding of attribution of value and importance to the voices of all stakeholders. Jay, I think we did want to try and sort of tease out some research topics or directions for the future. Do you think we did in the analysis of the papers?
I think that we certainly identified the key themes that the papers illuminate for us. So, for instance, several of the papers, particularly the two that looked at universal design by Christensen and colleagues and by Kim and colleagues, they really did look at how you can use foundational principles to ensure that you keep in mind the diversity of your test taker group, including those who might need special accommodations from the very beginning of your test development project, and how you maintain a view on that all the way through, and how you then reflect. And that's what the Kim and colleagues paper did. It reflected on the use of those tools that had been provided by both learners who were believed to need them, and learners who weren't believed to need them, the learners who didn't have a statemented special need. That to me was a really key theme, which actually becomes very relevant when a testing organization is either working with a commercial test delivery platform or is developing its own. I know this because I know we live in a real world. In the flurry of test development projects, one tends to focus first on the majority and then fill in the other requirements around the edges, where you're often asked to develop a list of your high-level requirements, and then you're asked to list whether they are must-haves, should-haves, or nice-to-haves. And it's very easy for things to be deprioritized. And one of the things that I feel is a contribution and also is a future direction for the field is how to ensure that we really stay true to the principles of universal design and keep in mind the totality of the test taker population, and don't, through pressure and expediency, simplify our task as we move through the test development process. And this is particularly key because language assessment has real practical consequences. I know I've said this about 10 times already, but we do things that make a difference in people's lives. That makes the decisions that we make as researchers so much more impactful. So that's one key thing that, Lynda, you and I do talk about in that final paper.
I think something else that really came out for us is the importance of not disconnecting the accommodation that is offered by, let's say, a testing agency from the actual place where the teaching and the learning and the use of the language happens. And in one sense, we're at a better place now because there's a much greater connecting up of teaching, learning, and assessment practice, both theory and practice. So that means that there's a greater understanding of the synergy that should exist within a sort of comprehensive learning system. And there were cases where what happens in the test is not necessarily perhaps what happened in the classroom situation, in the learning context. And of course, we wouldn't want that necessarily to be the case in any classroom, regardless of whether the candidates have special needs or not. So this joining up allows, I think, for future research to explore the relationship between what happens in the classroom, what happens in the language use situation, and how that language competence is assessed, particularly for students who have special needs. And the other thing I think I found really interesting was that this is not just a question of the language testing community doing a better job for candidates who have special needs. It's also the language testing community learning from the whole population of candidates, learners and test takers who are deploying a whole range of resources now for communication purposes. And it's beginning, I think, to challenge us in relation to construct definition, how we define our constructs. So our traditional go-to construct definition, which falls into more or less a 4 skills approach of reading, writing, listening, and speaking, is really no longer serving us very well, in my view. And there are some test takers who are accessing their print through all sorts of other text-to-speech mechanisms, using imaging software. And in a way, this is not just for their learning, it's for their entertainment, it's for their wider life skills. So notions of reading and listening perhaps now need to be redefined in a multimodal way. And people are beginning to do this in our field. Instead of talking about, reading and listening comprehension, perhaps we should be talking about consumption, processing, comprehension of print/audio media. We need to rethink some of our assumptions, and our test design and construction will have to follow on. But we have things to learn from all sorts of language users who are already using these because they have to use these. And the digital technology is now there to be able to do that through developments in assistive technology. It's another area where I think useful work could be done.
And if I could pick up on that, actually, because we sort of at the beginning talked about the tension between standardization and the provision of an accommodation. And what Lynda's talking about with respect to the construct of the test, what we are actually trying to get at, I think this special issue invites people to really start thinking a lot more foundationally about test construct and disconnecting it from how that construct is accessed. and allowing for different ways in which that construct could be accessed. Because what we've tended to do is said, this is what we're testing and this is how we're testing it. And the two are almost inextricably linked. And then when somebody comes in and says, well, I'm visually impaired, we think, oh God, how do we accommodate to that? Yeah. Whereas instead, if we thought of construct and then several different ways in which that could be assessed, that would allow for a much more nuanced way of being accessible and inclusive. I know that that presents challenges in terms of the interpretation of test scores, but I feel we're at a point in our field where we need to think how we can stay true to our concepts of validity and reliability and standardization and still be open to the true complexity of the learner that's out there. And it's something that we talk about in the paper that Lynda posited as possibility, that the previous special issue on test localization and this special issue actually share a relationship in that accommodated variants of tests are in essence a localization of the test for a specific learner or group of learners.
Yeah, I think Jay's absolutely right in making that point. And I suppose if we had an aspiration for the special issue, it would be that, first of all, the voices of people who are working in this area could be heard more clearly, because this is really, to some extent, an underserved and an underrepresented area in the field. So that needed to be addressed, and hopefully a special issue is at least one way of doing that. But also that it would provide a foundation for conversation and for action going forward. I mean, we'd like to think that it's not designed to be a criticism of what we do at the moment as a field, either in theory or in practice. Although I think we're right to hear the voices of Randers and Cornell about how the language that we use reflects the way we think and can inform the way we act. And I'm increasingly uncomfortable myself with using the term accommodation. It doesn't sit very comfortably with me anymore, but there isn't another term at the moment that works. So I suppose really what I'd like to feel that the special issue does with its collection of papers, which is bookended by our editorial and our postscript at the end, is it'll provide encouragement and support for test theoreticians, test providers, test practitioners, test researchers, all sorts of test taker stakeholders, as we work towards increasing and sustaining equity, access and inclusion in language testing, so that we all benefit, so that the whole of society is in a better place. It's not just about being generous or compassionate or to a particular part of society. This is about all of us thriving in the world of education, employment and wider society.
Are there any other final thoughts or messages that you would like to share regarding this topic with our audience?
I think one of the important things that I have learned from this special issue is how binary our thinking can be. I've talked about standard and non-standard, and we're a bit obsessed with test comparability in our field, and I understand that. But actually, in many ways, it's not appropriate to talk about people with disabilities and not disabilities, because in fact, in some senses, we are all disabled in some way or other. We increasingly start to talk now about hidden disabilities, but the reality is that we're each different from one another and have different needs. And the issue for language testers and also for language teachers and teacher educators is, how do you recognize the diversity that is before you and respond to the needs, often diverse, although some of those needs will be in common, of those for whom you are responsible. So it isn't a question of how can we make accommodations better, but how can we design tests and deliver tests in a way that enables all to access, to demonstrate to their best of their ability and to achieve their aspirations.
I think for me, what's very important about the special issue is not that we've thrown it all up in the air, but that we are saying the world is changing, the world has changed, and we are presented with a set of new understandings that we must now engage with to see how that informs future language testing practice. And two, we must really look at ways in which we can continue to learn from this work, which means that we need to find space for such studies to be done and to be published. So I would not like to leave a listener with the thought that we're saying nothing that we believed in before matters any longer, because that's not true. It's more a case of here's some new information that we now have to try and accommodate and be open to and flexible with because of how much what we do matters.
I would like to thank you for taking time to meet with me today for this interview and to share with our viewers information about the special issue and your thoughts on this topic. And I would also like to thank our viewers for watching this episode and encourage them to read this special issue, which is number 4 in volume 40 of Language Testing Journal. And I look forward to welcoming you all in the next issue of Language Testing Bytes.